Gardeners make repotting more complicated than it needs to be. And along the way, they've invented all kinds of myths. What I'd like to do in this program is to go through 13 different myths and have a look at how you really should repot plants. And this applies to houseplants, seedlings, and even outdoor plants that you're repotting. Myth number 1. Don't repot plants when they're dormant. So the idea here is that when plants are dormant, they can't recover from the operation you're going to perform. So don't do it at that time. There are a couple myths here. One is that most of our house plants are tropical plants, and they don't really go dormant. Now in winter, they might slow down growth, so they appear to be dormant, but they're still active. Roots are pulling up water, they're still pulling up nutrients, they're still photosynthesizing, and so on. They're just slowing down a little bit, usually because they can't get enough light in the wintertime. That's actually a perfect time to repot them. First of all, if you do repotting correctly and you're just moving a plant from one pot to a slightly larger pot, you're really not stressing the plant very much. Now, granted, if you take a plant and you chop it up in halves or quarters and multiply it, then you're doing a little more stress. But most repotting doesn't really stress the plant a lot. The other thing to understand is that when a plant is dormant, everything's going slower. And that's a perfect time to repot it because if you do some damage, it won't affect the plant very much. It's photosynthesizing less, so it's going to lose less moisture. The roots can be damaged a little bit and it doesn't stress the plant as much because it doesn't need as much water when it's slowed down. So as a general rule, winter and plants that are growing more slowly, that's the perfect time to repot them. Myth number 2, don't use a large pot. Most of the advice online will say, move to a pot that's next size up or at most 2 inches bigger than the one that the plant is now. Well, the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook has this to say, choosing larger containers is beneficial as they do not dry out as fast and you don't have to water as often. That's the exact opposite of gardening advice. So which one's right? Well, when I have a question like this, I like to go back to nature. What are the plants doing out in the wild? So what kind of pot do they grow in? How big is that pot? Well, they grow in the ground. So in effect, they're growing in a humongous pot. Plants are used to growing in big pots. That's what they do in nature. Taking a plant and putting it into a much larger pot does not harm the plant. In fact, the plant doesn't know it's in a big pot because it doesn't know anything about pots. The advice to pot up to a slightly larger pot is also very common when we're talking about seedlings. And people start seedlings in very tiny pots, and then a few weeks later they go to a slightly larger one, and then a slightly larger one, until it's big enough to go outside. That doesn't make any sense. You might as well take that seedling from the pot it germinated in and put it in the big pot that you want. If anything, it's going to grow faster and better that way. Now, there is one problem with large pots, and I think this is why a lot of gardeners don't like to use them. They can stay too wet. We have a small root system in a large pot, so the moisture stays there. The roots aren't using it up very fast. So if you're the type of gardener who overwaters all the time, well, you might be better off with smaller pots, but you're doing that for you, not the plant. Provided you water correctly, large pots are fine. There is another myth that's related to this one, and I see some people claiming that if you take a plant and put it in a large pot, it grows fast. That's also a myth. The growth rate of plants is genetically determined. Provided the environment is suitable, it's getting nutrients and moisture and light, it's going to grow at a certain rate. There's not much you can do to speed that up. Taking that plant and sticking it into a large pot is certainly not going to speed up its growth. Now, a very tiny pot can prevent a plant from growing to its potential. Myth number 3. When you repot, you should take all that soil and throw it away or put it in a compost pile. It's old. You shouldn't use that anymore. Well, that doesn't make any sense. First of all, potting media does not really get old. Now, there are reasons why people get rid of it, but they don't really make any sense. One is that if you have pests in that soil, root mealybugs. Then people try to discard the soil because they think they're going to get rid of the pest. But it's really hard to wash the pest off of every part of that plant. And if you have other potted plants, the pest will come from there into your newly potted plant. So replacing the soil rarely gets rid of pests. Same with diseases. If you have a disease, it's probably on the leaves and stems and on your table and your hands. It's everywhere. Replacing just the soil is not going to solve it. Some people like to get rid of the soil because they don't like the mushrooms that grow in your pot. Well, mushrooms are a sign of a healthy soil system. They're good. They only last a couple days. Enjoy them, and then they're gone. Same with mold on the soil. There's nothing wrong with that either, except too much mold may indicate that you're watering too much. You're keeping the soil too moist. Another problem you might have is white deposits on the soil. So if your water is very hard, it has minerals inside, and as you water, the water evaporates and it leaves behind the minerals. This process is very similar to what happens in a kettle when you get that white deposit. So after a while, you might see white crystals on the top of the soil, and they could be harmful to plants. So scrape the top inch off, throw that outside, and reuse the rest of it. For the most part, you do not have to throw that potting media out. You can reuse it. There are a few exceptions. One of the exceptions are orchids. Now, orchids grow in a very chunky media. They like mostly air around their roots, and that media does break down. So my rule of thumb is that every 2 years you repot that orchid. If you do that, they won't get too wet. If you have plants that are really sensitive to the amount of air in that media, then you might want to move to a chunkier media or replace it once in a while. And if you do replace peat moss and coir, you can use it for your other houseplants. Myth number 4. Don't fertilize after repotting. It's recommended that you just leave the plant alone for a while until it overcomes the stress of repotting, and then you can fertilize it. Well, that really doesn't make any sense either. I mean, today the plant needs nutrients to grow. You repot it, and tomorrow it doesn't need nutrients to grow. I don't know where the logic is in that. As soon as you've repotted the plant, it needs nutrients to grow. In fact, it might even need more than usual because now it has to fix those roots that you damaged or replace some leaves that you might have cut off. You should fertilize your plants right away. Now, the exception is that if you use potting media that comes with fertilizer already in it, you can wait a while till that fertilizer is all used up. But here's my problem with that approach. When is it used up? Well, unless you measure the nutrients, you have no idea. So what I like to do, even with soil that says it has nutrients in it, I fertilize. Because first of all, the amount of nutrients in these bags is pretty low. And second of all, I don't know when it's going to run out. So I want to make sure my plants get the nutrients they need. The same advice applies to seedlings. A lot of people grow seedlings and they don't like to fertilize right away. Well, as soon as that seedling starts making its true leaf, you should be fertilizing. Myth number 5. You should add some drainage in the bottom of the pot. These can be stones or broken up clay pot pieces. You want some layer in the bottom to help with drainage. Now, I've dealt with that in a separate video. That simply doesn't work. Putting material in the bottom of the pot does not increase drainage. What it does, it reduces the amount of soil in the pot, which makes it harder for plants to grow. But it has no value to the plants. Myth number 6. You should mist your plants after repotting. So I think the logic goes something like this. You've stressed the plant. You've probably damaged some roots in the process. So now the plant has trouble getting enough moisture. So we mist it. The truth is that misting does nothing for a plant. And you can see this for yourself. Mist your plant so that you have droplets of water in the leaves and watch it. How long does it take for those droplets to dry up? My house is about 50% humidity, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes for that water to evaporate. As soon as that water has evaporated, there is no high humidity around the plant. So you'd have to come along every 10 minutes and mist your plant all day and all night long if you want misting to help the plant. Misting simply doesn't work. For most repotting jobs, you haven't done a lot of damage to the roots, and in that case, just leave the plant where it is. It'll be fine. I do water right after I repot, so there's moisture around the roots, and that's all it needs. If during the repotting process you've removed a lot of roots, maybe it was root bound and you took a lot of those off, or you've divided a plant so you've cut away a lot of the root system, and you're really worried about it not having a high humidity environment, then put it in a plastic bag or some kind of container, an aquarium or something like that. It has to be an area that's closed. Water the plant and then leave it. Provided it's closed, the humidity will go up to about 100% and stay there. And you can leave that plant in there for several days or a couple weeks until it grows new roots. Then slowly open the lid, let some more air in. That will lower the humidity and get it conditioned to the regular humidity you have in your home. But that's for exceptional cases. In most cases, you don't need to do that. And that is that a lot of people use pebble trays to increase the humidity around their plant. They don't work either. In fact, what happens with pebble trays is that the water in the tray slowly evaporates. And an inch or two above the tray, you do have higher humidity. But that moisture now is going out throughout the whole room. And if we go up 5-6 inches, we find that the humidity there is the same as it is everywhere in the room. Pebble trays do not increase the humidity around your plants. Myth number 7. If you see roots growing out of the pot, it's time to repot. Well, this myth might be true. So if you have a plant that's been in the pot a long time and it's very root bound, that whole ball is just full of roots and there's no room left and there's some roots coming out the bottom, that tells you something. So what I would do if you see roots coming out the bottom is take the plant out of the pot and have a look at it. If the pot is full of roots, then yeah, let's repot. Let's get rid of some of those roots. But if the root system looks good, then roots coming out of the pot is nothing more than roots going for a walk. They're looking for a place to grow. You can cut them off if you want and leave the plant. It doesn't need to be transplanted. Orchids also have a habit of making roots that come out of the pot, and that's quite normal. Those roots can absorb moisture from the air. That's how they've been programmed genetically, and it's quite normal for them. Don't sweat roots coming out of the pot. Myth number 8. Plants should always be repotted into a larger pot. That's simply not true. You can take a plant and put it in a larger pot. You can put it in the same size pot. In fact, in most plants, you can actually take it and cut it back a little bit and put it in a smaller pot. All of those will work. You need to decide what you're trying to accomplish with that plant. How large do you want it to get? One way to control the size of a plant is by keeping it in smaller pots. Think of bonsai. These are large trees that are only this big after 100 years. Why? Well, because they have very small pots. They can't grow a large root system. My wife's anthurium has been in the same pot for about 30 years. I do repot it every 3 years or so, but mostly because it gets too tall. So I take it and I cut off the bottom part and sink it back down again and put it back in the same pot. And that's good for another 3 years. I also grow a lot of orchids, and a large Phalaenopsis orchid never goes into a pot that's bigger than 6 inches. They just don't need it. These plants, they grow taller over time, but they don't really get bigger. If they've got 5 leaves on them, you're doing really well. An orchid like this is never going to have 20 leaves. So it's pretty much the same size its whole life. And so I just repot it back in the same pot. If you want a plant to grow much larger, then a bigger pot does help. Myth number 9. Don't remove any of the roots. Leave them alone. Now that's generally good advice, but it really depends on the plant. If a plant is completely root bound, it has a couple problems. First of all, you can't water it very well. What happens is that when you put water in this pot, it just runs down the outside of the root, the space between the roots and the pot. It never soaks into the root ball, so the center of the pot is never wet. If you have that kind of a condition, it's actually a good idea to cut away some of those roots. You can make some vertical slits, or you can cut it into a box shape and just get rid of a lot of those roots. That does stress the plant, but the plant will regrow those roots. If you're having problems watering that plant, it's better to repot and cut some of the roots off. That will allow you to properly water it, and it will actually grow better that way. Myth number 10, repotting should be done every year. I know gardeners like rules, and the reason they like them is that they can follow a rule very easily. It's much harder to understand why they're doing it. So if you repot every year, you'll probably have success with your plants. In fact, I've already given you a rule for orchids. I repot every 2 years, and that's a good rule to follow. And I do tell beginner gardeners to do that. Repot your orchid every 2 years. But I know why, and I usually try to explain that. The media breaks down. If I would switch to a different kind of media that doesn't break down, I no longer have to repot every 2 years. So I strongly urge all gardeners to understand why they're doing something. In most cases, you do not have to repot every year. The soil doesn't get old. It lasts for years and years. Provided the plant's not growing too large and still fits in that pot, just leave it. Have a reason for repotting. Myth number 11, sick plants should be repotted. I see a lot of people posting pictures of their plants online, and they're usually not looking so great. They got spots in the leaves are falling off. Whatever the problem is, they're just not healthy plants. And almost always, someone will write in and say, repot it. Give it some fresh soil. There's this idea that the plants are living off the soil. The soil is feeding the plants, and when we have a sick one, well, we need to feed it better. We need to give it some fresh food. We shouldn't be thinking of plants that way. If the plant doesn't have enough food, then we simply have to fertilize the pot, and that will solve the problem. Repotting doesn't stress a plant very much, but a sick plant is stressed more with repotting. So always be very careful when you repot. Now, sometimes I see small plants and they're sitting in big pots, and people say, well, repot that. The pot's too big. Well, we've discussed that already. It's not that the pot is too big, but the owner is probably overwatering. And if we get it in a smaller pot, it's less likely that the gardener will overwater the plant. So try and understand what the problem is. In most cases, it's best not to repot a sick plant. Figure out what the problem is. Understand why it's sick. Solve the problem. If repotting would solve the problem, then go ahead and do that. But if the problem is not related to the soil or the size of the pot or the watering habits, then it's probably best not to repot. Here's a related myth. Myth 12. Newly purchased plants should be repotted right away. There are some good reasons for doing it, but there are also very good reasons not to do it. If you purchase this plant from a nursery that cares about its plants, that plant has been repotted not that long ago. They shouldn't be selling plants that need to be repotted. So as a general statement, you probably don't need to repot, but there might be some good reasons for repotting. For example, you just bought a new African violet. You brought it home, and you already have some African violets. And you notice that the soil of the new one is quite different than the soil you use. Perhaps yours have a lot more perlite in it, so they're a lot more porous. The one you purchased is in straight peat moss, and so it stays wet longer than your plant. Now you have two different groups of plants, and you have to water them differently. And your habit is to go and water all your plants at once. And what that means is that the new plant is either going to be overwatered or underwatered depending on what kind of soil it's in. So in a situation like that, you're a more experienced gardener and you say to yourself, well, if I put this plant in my soil, my preferred soil, it's going to grow better because I know how to water it. So that's actually a good reason for doing it. I grow my streptocarpus in quite porous media. It's about 50% perlite now. And if I went out and bought a new one, I probably will repot it because I water all my plants at the same time. A lot of the orchids that are being sold are potted in sphagnum moss. And I know that that is really hard to water correctly. It's either too wet or too dry. So a plant like that, I tend to repot right away, even if it's in flower, and get it in my media because I know how to water my media. I know how to grow them in my media. I have that experience. But if you're getting a new house plant and you don't have experience with that plant, or you're not an experienced gardener, then don't repot right away. Have a good reason to repot. Otherwise, leave it for a while. Myth number 13. You should sterilize your potting media before you repot. Well, let's straighten a few things out. First of all, there's no such thing as sterile potting media. Even when the bag says it's sterile, it's not sterile. Nobody makes sterile potting media. If you take potting media and you put it in the oven and you cook it for a while, that's not sterile either. Now, it may be sterile while it's still hot, but as soon as you take it out of the oven, the microbes from the air are landing on it and starting to grow. You've got microbes on your hands. There's microbes in the pots that you're going to use. There's microbes on the plant that you're going to put into the pot, and so on. There's no such thing as sterile soil. Now, what you can do is heat up soil to kill animal life. So I've seen some people heat it up to kill fungus gnats, and it will kill the eggs and the larvae from fungus gnats. I'm not really sure that's necessary. Now, if you have an old bag of soil and there's some holes in it and you suspect fungus gnats have been laying their eggs in there, well, perhaps that's a good idea, is to heat it up to kill those. Now, if you're using soil from outside or you're using your compost from your compost pile outside, it may have weed seeds in there. And so some people heat that up to kill the weed seeds. They're pretty easy to kill too. Trying to kill fungal spores and microbes in soil is going to be really difficult. You have to get to the right temperatures, you have to cook it the right length of time, and so on. And as I said, once you bring it out of the oven, it's no longer sterile, so you can't keep it sterile. And the bottom line is there's not much point in having sterile potting media because your home isn't sterile. It's covered in microbes everywhere. If you want to learn more about microbes, have a look at my book, Microbe Science for Gardeners. Unless you have a very specific reason for heating your soil, don't bother. Just use it the way it is. I've been gardening for 40 years and I've never tried to sterile soil. Never had a reason to. So there you have it, my myths about repotting houseplants. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something, then you should also watch my next video, which are houseplant myths. This video here is loaded with myths about growing houseplants. Happy gardening.